Hello and welcome to our video on Azure Private Endpoints. Before we talk about private endpoints, let's address something called the Azure Private Link. Now, the symbol for Azure Private Link is, as you can see over here, okay? But what is that symbol all about? What is Azure Private Link used for? All right, so I'm going to do some scribblings in a moment. The first question you must ask yourself is, what is this Azure Private Link being used to solve? Okay, what problem is this private link designed to solve? Let's imagine your company is called company xyz.com, has a virtual network, and you want to connect to a PaaS resource such as the Azure SQL. So PaaS is an abbreviation for Platform as a Service. Microsoft provisions a platform as a service for you that you can consume, and you want to be able to connect to it. Now, SQL database as a pass, when you create your resources, you would normally specify a public endpoint as a connectivity method. So I showed you in the last video that by default, when you go into networking, you will see that this pass solution already expects internet access or access to it from the World Wide Web. Okay. So having the public endpoint actually means that the resource is assigned a public IP address. And so Microsoft will assign a public IP address, which is the symbol here. And maybe the IP address might be 20.44.xy.z. Okay. So even though both your virtual network and Azure SQL database are located within the same Azure cloud platform, the connection between the two, which is the VNet and your Azure Platform as a Service SQL, is actually going over the internet. So you from a VNet, you're actually going this way by public internet to hit the public IP address of your SQL, which is your Platform as a Service. Now, this is not a good thing. The problem here is that your Azure SQL database now, this database hosted here, okay, is now exposed to the internet because of the presence of this public IP address. This is publicly published. Everyone knows about this IP address range coming from Azure, okay? And that exposure creates multiple security risks. The same security risks are present when an Azure resource is accessed via a public IP address from a number of locations, even when you have a paired Azure virtual network. If you have an on-premises network that uses Express Route and even Microsoft peering, or you have a customer's Azure Virtual Network that connects to an Azure service offered by a company, as long as there's a public IP address here, you've opened your database to security risks. So someone might ask, what is a solution? That's why I said from the beginning, we must examine the problem that the private link is designed to solve. Now, before we go into the solution, let me go through this diagram one more time. On my left-hand side here, you see remote workers, and you can see they're all going via the public internet, go via the public IP address, and talk to your SQL database. Your Azure on the virtual network on this right-hand side is doing the exact same thing, going via the public internet, going via public IP, and then going to the SQL. Of course, this public cloud, public internet, is used by myriads of machines. Well, good people and bad people. And most times, bad people want to capitalize on the free flow of information over public internet to hold it to ransom. Okay, so you don't want to design it this way. You want to design it in such a way that you can connect securely to your platform as a service without using a dedicated public IP address. Your private link is designed to eliminate the security risk by removing the public part of the connection. What do I mean by this? At the moment, because of this public IP or public endpoint presence to your database, there's already eyes from the internet trying to attack your resource by attacking this public IP. Okay, so private links, they are designed to eliminate these security risks. Okay, let's have a quick overview of private links then. Your private link provides secure access to Azure services. I'll prove that in a moment. Okay, your private link achieves that security by replacing this resource, your DB, okay, public endpoint, with a private network interface, which is what you see here, what you and I will call private what? Endpoint. Now, there are three key points to consider when it comes to architecting your platform as a service in this way. Your Azure resource, this Azure resource pass service becomes, in a sense, a part of a virtual network, although it sits somewhere in an Azure space somewhere, although it's not your physical IaaS device like a VM, this ultimately becomes part of your network, your private network, because it's given what? A, pri- a private link to your private endpoint. Now, the connection to this resource will now use Microsoft's own dedicated channel. Okay, we'll call it Microsoft MS Backbone. Okay, instead of going via public internet, which is a problem. So you're actually avoiding this and that and going securely via Microsoft. Let's say this is Microsoft back into your environment. Okay. And once you've done this private link, you can now configure this database or platform as a service never ever again to expose itself using public IP, and that will now remove that risk that you had once on the IP address. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let me drag this and remove from the picture. Let's leave the internet there for now because some people might be able to connect if we allow them access into here by the internet. But leave the internet here for now. Okay. Now let's work on what the private endpoint really is. Your private endpoint, which is sketched over here. Okay. Your private endpoint, as you can see here, is a network interface that uses a private IP address from a virtual network. Whereas you have a VM and it has a NIC attached to it, you can attach a certain NIC to your platforms of service, your databases, your storage account, anything else to your network using a private link that connects to private endpoint, which is actually a network interface card like that in a subnet, which automatically talks to other services in the same VNet unless otherwise not allowed. Now, this network interface here connects you privately, connects your network privately, okay, to the service powered by Microsoft Azure Private Link, which is a link here. Okay. Now, these guys are in a certain house, for example. They have the ability to call each other because, or they even use their laptops to talk over Skype or any other messaging services to each other. They can also use their phones and call each other. But then they are within proximity. Why would they risk the chances of someone hearing a conversation when they can talk to each other, even in a whisper? Okay, all right. So Microsoft says instead of routing traffic via public IP address and via internet and now back into your network, let's do it this way. Let's do things securely. Come through Microsoft Network and come through your NIC, talk to your network, and then you're all happy. Okay, so when you enable a private endpoint, you are bringing the service into your virtual network. You are actually taking this SQL box and putting it here. Okay, and now it's connected to your network. That's what you're doing. Okay, it's almost like taking a rope, which is what represents, a whole rope, and dragging it over here into this network. Okay, now services that can use private endpoints includes storage accounts, Cosmos DBs, SQL databases. Okay, um, and these are your own services when you use the private link service. Okay, let's look at a few properties of your private endpoint. Okay, your private endpoint will always have a unique name within the resource group. It needs a dedicated subnet, which is what you see here, subnets. I'll call it PEP subnet. Okay, and its private link resource or ID. Okay, and it'll have a target resource. What are you targeting? Then it will be a connection that is approved. All right, it has many paths to it, and of course, you can see the connection states when you work on it. All right, so this is what private endpoints really are. And when you go into your virtual network and you look at connected devices, you will see one NIC called private endpoint dedicated or attached to private link, which is also attached to what your service, your platform service. Okay. Now let's head over to Azure and demonstrate how this is done. Okay. I'll see you there. In a previous video, we dedicated it to virtual network integration. That's what I call it. Enabling access into your storage account using your virtual network and the subnets. Okay. Now we're going to actually change it around to say, I want to bring this storage account, which may sit on Azure somewhere, into my network. So this line here you see is I'll call it a PV link, private link. And we'll have a NIC, which will sit in a subnet. The NIC is what we call the private endpoint. Okay. All right. So that goes into your storage account. We're going to do that. We're going to make sure this storage account has an IP address in our subnets, and it could be whatever subnet that we have or we plan to put it under. Okay, so when I go into First Virtual Network, we've allowed the front end. Okay, now if I don't want to do that, I can disable all the access this way and dedicate private endpoint. Okay, of course, they'll tell me to save this, and I'll say now no access at all. I just want to come through a private endpoint. Now, private endpoint consists of two things. Of course, your resource, its private link, and then the endpoint itself. So I want to put this now in the exact same location as the first subnet. So same name, and I'm going to call it, this one is called a cloud shell storage. Let's call it cloud shell storage, PEP, private endpoint. Now, immediately you see that it has created something called the network interface name, Cloud Shell Storage Private Endpoint NIC. The location is in UK South. All right. Then I head over to Next Resource. Then it tells you what is your target sub-resource. The type of sub-resource for the resource selected above that your private endpoint will be able to access. It's asking you, okay, let's explain this a little better. You have this storage account. You're creating a private endpoint. Okay, you can create a number of them. Okay. Now, every private endpoint must target something in this storage account. Now, a storage account consists of a blob, a table, a queue, a file, and of course, you can see web and DFS, okay, distributed file systems and web. But we want to target the blob, okay, so that now from the same code that I ran the last time, if I put it on that VM and I run it, it's able to write to that container. Remember blobs and containers, okay? So I can select that. I'll select the blob and blobs there, okay? All right, now let's go next. Asking about virtual network. Well, I want to stick the NIC in the front end subnet. Oh, I don't want to put it in the back end. I just want to put it in the front end, just like before. Okay, so instead of involving the whole subnet, I just want to put a NIC in the subnet there. Now over here, you can dedicate a subnet for it, or just stick it in one of the subnets. As long as it's compatible, you can put it with the rest of everything else. Maybe ideally, it would be a good idea to dedicate a subnet for it, called, for example, your storage account private endpoints. But on this occasion, let's take it here. And it's asking you, do you want to locate an IP address dynamically or do you want to make it statically? Of course, if I make it dynamically, it means that I have to just use the DNS because the IP address will keep changing. All right, I can also say statically, and that will always have an IP address. But let's just leave it as it is. Okay, because Microsoft has intelligence to know I'm trying to get this to this service. All right, it's asking you about application security group. We don't need one. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and do next. Good. Now, anytime you create a private endpoint, you need a DNS record. And in fact, Microsoft actually says it here. To connect privately with your private endpoint, you need a DNS record. Never forget this, okay? So it's mandatory, it's a must. You must have it. Microsoft recommends that you integrate your private endpoint with the private DNS zone. So if you have a DNS zone already, you can put it there because the private endpoint and your service name and private endpoint can now be pointed to the DNS name of your service from your private DNS records. Okay, so you can come down here and create that DNS record. Do you want to integrate your private DNS zone? It says yes or no. Let's look at what happens when you say no. Then nothing happens. Of course, the recommendation is make sure you integrate. So I'll do yes. Same subscription, same resource group, and then finally a private DNS zone. I suppose if I had one, I could put it there, but no, every private endpoint is dedicated a DNS zone. And now the resource targeting two things, your DNS zone and private endpoint. Let's review and create the tagging. You can do however you want to do it. And I'll do create. And so you can see the deployment is in progress and it's created a private endpoint. You can open that up and see what else it's doing. Okay. Now the type is Microsoft Network Private Endpoint. The resource ID in the subscription is called that Cloud Shell Storage Private Endpoint. The resource retargeting is a Cloud Shell Storage Private Endpoint, which is attached to the private storage account, or let's say the storage that we have. So it's created the private endpoint and it's creating the DNS. So let's duplicate this. And you can see when I get to private DNS zones that there is a private link. You see that? To a blob, because that's exactly the sub-target resource, a blob. Okay. All right. And when I click into it, what do I see? It shows already that there is a storage account called CSB ends with 43, and it now has an IP address in my subnet called the front end. Okay, we will go back into that in a second, but let's go and double check the deployment to make sure it's all done. Okay, so it's also created a virtual network link because you're bringing that private link into your virtual network. And let's go to the resource. Let's break it down then, shall we? So the first thing I see, and I suppose you see it already, is that my private endpoint has created successfully. The type is the private endpoint. Okay. It's in the right subscription, of course, and its private link resource is that one. The nick is called that, and it sits in this front-end subnet. Now, yes, and the target sub resource is a blob. Okay, and you can see the connection status is what? Approved. All right. When I click into here, it will show me what this private link resource is. So the private link resource is what will determine what you've attached this private link to. Private link resource. So click into that and it takes me to my storage account, which, yes, behold, is that one over there. That's an IP address. So now I can connect to the storage account internally for my virtual network. So when I go to virtual networks now and I select the first virtual network, I can see that we have these subnets 1 and 2. Okay. But then when I go into connected devices, I see that there is a nick of something. And what is it? It's a private endpoint, although the symbol is still a nick because the network interface. It's a private endpoint nick with that IP address, which we saw in our DNS earlier. And this is the one that's attached to what? The storage account. So when I click into it, it tells me it's attached to this storage account private endpoint. Click into that. You bring into this endpoint, and when I click on the link takes me to the storage account. So let's sketch that, shall we? You have a storage account. Let's assume the storage account is a database or a PaaS solution somewhere. You want to connect it to your virtual network. And so you employ a private virtual link, which is now attached to a NIC card and talks to your subnets in your VNet. One more time. Your platform as a service originally was exposed to the internet using public IP address. We saw that security attacks could be present because there are rogue people there who are very sad vectors and all they do is attack systems. So we want to get rid of this because we have a virtual network and our service in a subnet. We want this also to be in the subnet. So we need to drag this into our network. And to do that, we use a private link. I normally call it private virtual link, but it's really private link. And then it comes into something called a private endpoint, which is a NIC that sits on your virtual network and gets an IP address of that subnet. So from now onwards, by default, because subnets can talk to each other, you can talk to this as if it was another VM. Okay, you can actually add NSG to the subnet and create rules to block or to allow what can talk to that. Okay, so it's extremely powerful. All right. Okay. Let's head over to make sure everything is done. Let's go back to storage account and now let's go networking one more time. You can see that we don't enable public access anymore. It's disabled, but now we enable private access. And you can see that this is your connection name. This is connection state is approved. It's targeting the cloud shell storage private endpoint, and the description says it's also approved. And everyone is happy. We are all happy. Okay. So I hope this has really been helpful to you. I'd like to thank you for viewing. I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye for now.